When it comes to energy economics related to community energy systems, my go to expert is research faculty member Steve Colt, our senior economist with the Alaska Center for Energy and Power.
Hello, my name is Steve Colt. I'm a research professor in energy economics at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power.
Steve has an interesting spin on LCOE, or the levelized cost of energy, that economists typically use to compare one sort of generation source to another. Steve likes to also take into account the social cost of energy, and so he's created a metric called the levelized social cost of energy, or LSCOE. I recently had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with Steve talking a little bit more about these concepts, LCOE and LSCOE.
Today I want to talk about another acronym that pops up a lot in analyzing energy systems, and that's the LCOE, which stands for Levelized Cost of Energy.
We already learned about LCA, or life cycle analysis, from Daisy, which is one approach to quantifying the costs and the benefits associated with any individual project with an eye towards sustainability. LCOE is really not that different. They both essentially mash together a lot of different costs associated with energy production and try to come up with a number that shows what the costs of a single kilowatt hour of electricity would be to produce. That's what LCOE stands for, and it's widely accepted in both the renewable energy and in the conventional power generation industry. And for that reason, it's worth taking some time to understand how it's calculated.
I want to show you an idea for expanding the concept of LCOE so that we can think about all of the costs of energy production, especially including the costs related to climate change or other environmental effects of energy systems. So if you just look at the LCOE that you might find published for, let's say, a coal-fired power plant versus a wind energy system, and if you took Alaska numbers like I did last night, you would see that producing more power from coal costs about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, and producing more power from wind, if you buy it from an independent producer like we do in parts of Alaska, you would see that that wind power costs about 11 cents. So to summarize, if we just look at the LCOE, we would see coal is 6 cents per kilowatt hour, wind is 11. So the coal looks like the much better deal.
But in this case, we're only taking into account what an economist like Steve would call the private costs. The cost for the machinery or the labor or for land or taxes or whatever you're actually paying to get the power, without taking into account any of these broader environmental impacts.
So now let's shift gears. Now let's think about these other costs of energy. And I'm just going to use wildfires resulting from global warming as just one example. But of course there are many. But let's look at that one a little bit and think about carbon emissions from power generation. In the case of coal, we have a pretty good idea what those are. And economists like to talk about a new term, maybe, called the social cost of an energy system, or the social cost of carbon. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean by that all the costs. So the carbon emissions themselves are said to cause external costs because nobody really has to pay for them, at least not when they produce the power. Of course, we may have to pay later if we have to fight a wildfire or if we lose our home to a wildfire.
So the social cost includes everything, including the external costs associated with environmental effects.
So it might be good if we had a new term. We could put an S into our acronym and talk about the levelized social cost of energy, meaning, again, all of the costs, including the environmental and climate-related costs. And in fact, we know how to do that with a fair degree of accuracy. And if we were to do it, or if we crunch the numbers for the coal plant, we would have to make one really important assumption, and that is what is the cost of carbon emissions per ton emitted? Well, that's been studied to a great deal of, I wouldn't say accuracy, but it's been studied with a great deal of effort. And the number that keeps popping up is actually about $60 per ton, metric ton of carbon emitted. So we can put that into the number crunching machine, if you will. We know how much the coal plant emits, and if we value it, or if we price it at $60 a ton, then we get a very clear result that in fact you have to add 6 cents per kilowatt hour of external cost, and you get the result that the social cost of coal-fired power, using Alaska numbers, is more like 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And why is that important? Because look at how it flips the cost comparison.
So once you start taking into account the social costs instead of just the LCOE, the picture changes quite a bit. And now coal, which is our most carbon intensive source of energy, doesn't look quite so good.
If you're trying to save your ratepayers money, and if you actually had to pay the social cost through a carbon fee or maybe some internal decision that you're going to take account of these costs, now the wind looks cheaper or less expensive. So thinking about the social cost of energy is important both conceptually and because you can actually do these calculations and potentially change the decisions that you end up making about which energy source is really the least expensive source.
As Steve mentioned, LCOE is widely used in both the renewable energy and the conventional electric power industry, so it's worth understanding and it's likely something that you'll need to take into account when planning a project. Whether or not you add in the social costs is really up to you and the rest of the project team. The bottom line is that LCOE, with or without the S, along with life cycle analysis, are two different approaches to weighing the costs and the benefits of a particular project depending on the metrics that you want to measure its performance against.